It's true, but there's another feature that we should not overlook. Both President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev wanted to avoid a cataclysmic war. Neither side wanted a nuclear exchange or a war that would end up being global and hopelessly destructive. That seems to be missing. It seems to me that in the current administration, there is an acute lack of fear of just how devastating a nuclear exchange could be, number one. And number two, no appreciation for high-intensity conventional warfare as something that we do not want to wage anywhere in the Western world. For that matter, why would we want to wage it in Northeast Asia? We live in a different world today. The military solution to every problem is the wrong solution. And that is a huge problem in Washington. There's this lack of appreciation of just how destructive war is, not just for your enemy, but for you.
Part of the propaganda campaign for every war that we get into is that people like you who question the war are your patriotism is questioned. You're accused of being sympathetic with Vladimir Putin. How do you react to that kind of accusation?
Well, you're right. We tend to demonize anyone that we want to essentially dethrone or where we're planning regime change. And this regime change thing has gotten us into severe trouble. All we have to do is look at what's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, look at what happened in Libya. The notion that we would try to impose regime change on Russia is sheer lunacy. It's not going to happen. As far as what is President Putin, I don't know the man. I've never met the man. I don't speak Russian. In fact, I grew up in North Philadelphia with large numbers of Ukrainians and Poles, so I'm very familiar with them. And I studied Soviet and German operations and strategy in school. But the point is that it doesn't matter, frankly, who is sitting in the Kremlin, as long as that person is someone who doesn't want a war. And I think it's very clear that Vladimir Putin does not want a war with the West. He's not prepared for it, doesn't want to go to war with us. There is no evidence at all that he wants to reconquer Eastern Europe, the countries occupied at the end of the Second World War. Far from it. That's more trouble than it's worth. It's a losing proposition economically. He's not interested in that. We are the ones that have pressed this issue with him. We are the ones pressing to the East. He's not pressing to the West. He wants to negotiate an end to this, but if he can't, he will go as far as he needs to in Ukraine to ensure that his country is secure. Now, I think we should intervene along with our allies. We should offer to hold talks, no preconditions, drop all this nonsense about the Russians have to commit national suicide in order to qualify as partners for a negotiation. That's a lot of nonsense. We need to treat them as equals, not as enemies. In fact, I worked with the Russians in the early part of this century when I was at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, and I interacted with them when I was on active duty in the 90s. The Russians did not behave like enemies. In fact, they bent over backward to assist us when we were dealing with Islamist terrorism, provided us with enormously important intelligence. We could never have gotten into Afghanistan the way we did without their help in 2001 and 2002. So I reject this notion that the relationship that we have with Russia must be hostile. I don't think it needs to be. Doesn't mean we should become bosom buddies and friends, but we need to understand their interests, which was essentially President Kennedy's argument. They are willing to understand ours. All of this is about interest. This is not personal. This is not an emotional fight. This is about interests, and you're absolutely right. We have no core strategic interest in this area, nor should we. But we do have an interest in ending conflict. That's what we should be focused on.
And what about the geopolitical implications of pushing Russia closer and closer to China, which is happening with this war?
You know, China and Russia have become natural partners for reasons that have nothing to do with us. And that's simply because Russia has an abundance of resources, an abundance of food, minerals, timber, you name it, coal, iron. Everything that China needs for its scientific industrial expansion lies in Russia. Russia alone can largely fuel China, if that's what it comes down to. At the same time, Russia needs secure borders in the East. As you pointed out, Russia has had wars with Japan. Russia was conquered by the Mongolian hordes. It wants peace in Central Asia. It wants peace on its borders. And contrary to popular belief, having been in that part of the world, I can tell you that there are not hundreds of millions of Chinese anxious to move north and live in Siberia. That is not an appealing idea for them. So the notion that somehow or another they should be at war with each other is nonsense. There's no reason for conflict. They've buried the hatchet. They want to do business. By the way, even the Japanese and the Chinese have largely buried the hatchet. They're not going to go into a war with each other. They understand how mutually destructive that could be. We've got to get out of this war business. Now, that doesn't mean we'll never fight again, but the problems that we may face in the future don't need to be in Eastern Europe. They don't even need to be in Northeast Asia.
When President Biden made his statement that he thought we needed regime change in Russia, and then Lloyd Austin in 2022, who's his Secretary of Defense, said that one of the objectives, the mission objective in Ukraine, was degrading the Russian military force and exhausting it so that it can't fight anywhere else in the world. Would you consider that an objective, a military objective, exhaustion?
No, I mean, it's absolutely absurd. It's ridiculous. How are you going to do that, and why would you want to bother? I mean, the supposition is Russia is a danger to us, and we have to somehow or another reduce that danger by harming it. I don't sign up for the notion that Russia is a great danger to us. They're not planning on invading us. They don't want to destroy us. They actually would like to do business with us. I think what we need to understand is that what we're getting now, instead of what Lloyd Austin described, is the opposite. Russia had a very small standing professional army at the beginning of this process. The plans are now to maintain an army of over 1 million men. They've already got over 750,000 in the field. And then you go beyond those that are in the field in the East, there's another 150 to 200,000 out there in Siberia and along the border. You're now looking at the restoration of Russian national military power on a scale that we haven't seen since the 1980s. That's the outcome of this stupid war, the very opposite of what we said we wanted. On the other hand, our military is in ruins. It's in terrible condition. We've wasted decades of stupid spending on the wrong solutions, the wrong force structure, the wrong strategy for the wrong reasons. These chickens are coming home to roost, and we're not even talking about the damaging social engineering that someone like your father would have, or your uncle would have dismissed out of hand as lunacy because he served in the Navy and he had some concept of what discipline and cohesion meant. We have people now that don't have any idea, and yet they've decided to act like God and tinker with things that are destructive. So we have a huge morale problem, a discipline problem. These things are not what you want if you're going to tempt your potential adversary into conflict. And we still have roughly, 30, 40,000 troops in Poland, another 10, 15,000, maybe 20,000 in Romania. And we keep urging the Poles to be prepared to join with us to do what? I can't imagine. Fortunately, the Polish chief of staff has spoken out recently and made it very clear that the Polish military is not ready to fight in Eastern Europe. It doesn't have the ammunition to sustain itself. So hopefully more sober-minded people will prevail. But at the moment, it seems like we have the finest yes men in the history of the armed forces who will repeat stupidity without interruption. And that has got to stop.
Ultimately, what is the chance of nuclear war, and how does the nuclear weapons of the Russians compare to the U.S. forces and U.S. capabilities?
Well, the Russians have probably 1,000 or more warheads than we do on hand. They may have some additional launchers, but to be perfectly frank, we have thousands of launchers and weapons. They have thousands. We have more than enough nuclear capability to annihilate life on planet Earth. So it's not so much a question of numbers. It's a question of thinking and intent. The Chinese declared a long time ago, no first use. They just simply said, we will not use a nuclear weapon if we are attacked. That's our last resort. If you don't use it, we won't use it. I think the Russians take the same position. I read through their doctrine, looked at it very carefully. They have recently stated that if they see evidence that we are on the verge of using a nuclear weapon, they would consider attacking us. But that is not something they expect, and it's not something they want. We are the ones that have changed our attitude. When President Biden spoke in Warsaw, at the same time he was in Warsaw, they rewrote the nuclear doctrine, and we had essentially adopted the same position. If you don't use nuclear weapons against us, we won't use them against you. We've now altered that and said that we may consider certain conditions involving only high-end conventional forces. If we judge that to be threatening enough, we may use nuclear weapons. I think that's catastrophic. I think they should be taken off the table. But this is the new wave in Washington. They think strategic ambiguity is a good thing. I think it's a catastrophe.
And what about the fact that we've walked away from a series of treaties that limited short range or medium range nuclear missiles and anti-ballistic missiles? Can you just talk a little bit about that and what kind of signal that sends, not only Russia, but the rest of the world?
Well, the precondition for arms control to be successful is that you maintain an arsenal that is strong enough, flexible enough, capable enough that no one in their right mind is going to challenge it. We've done that. Now, we did sign on to certain treaties that removed, from our standpoint at the time, a potentially destabilizing weapon system, and that was the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. We fielded something called the Pershing II. Most of your viewers are not aware of this, but the Pershing II was a hypersonic missile. Once launched, you couldn't shoot it down. And putting those in Germany put Russia's arsenal at high risk. The Russians eventually came to the table, and we decided to take it off the table because we saw it as very destabilizing and dangerous. I think it was unfortunate that we left that treaty. Now, there are other areas that are a little more vague.
We left that treaty when in 2019 or something, right?
Yes. And I don't think that should have lapsed. I think that's something that we should have retained. But again, we're at a point now where we are seen as having been so dishonest in our dealings with Moscow. One wonders what the Russians would sign that we were willing to sign. I mean, this is a huge problem. Our credibility is gone. I don't think the Russians are ready to sit down and talk to us about much of anything. That's why I think it's very dangerous. If nothing else, we should step forward and say no first use. We will not use nuclear weapons. And that's absolutely vital today, right now in Eastern Europe.
Do you have optimism for the future? What do you see the future as?
If you and others like you in the political arena demand the truth, fight for the truth, represent the truth, then I'm optimistic because I think we can turn around the disaster that we have in our hands today inside the Beltway. But other than that, if we don't move in that direction, I don't see much good on the horizon because I'm worried that our fragile economy and corrupted financial system will both implode. And the danger that I think about on a routine basis is the fire sale of U.S. treasuries overseas first, whether it's the Chinese, the Japanese, the Saudis, whomever that owns our treasuries, starts to sell these things off. That puts the economy into a tailspin into the dirt. There's no easy solution to that. We're already watching the bank runs increase in frequency and number. That's not going to go away. The biggest issue is confidence. There is a lack of confidence in the banking system, a lack of confidence in our government. That lack of confidence is here at home and it's overseas. That's not going to be easy to fix, but we need new faces, new people with a fresh approach. It's the only way to save us. And that means, if you're the chief law enforcement officer of the United States, as the president is, you've got to enforce the law. We're not doing it. We're not doing it on our borders. We're not doing it in our cities. Has to happen. I think your most important contribution right now is twofold. First of all, you've done something that very few political figures in this country have undertaken in a long time. You have insisted on the truth. You have pursued the truth in spite of enormous opposition presented by the pharmaceutical corporations and the huge money that they can contribute to people on the Hill to stop you. And you have been successful. You have demonstrated not only that you can find the truth and reveal it, you've also demonstrated that there is an appetite for it in the American population. That has to continue. We need the truth on Ukraine, just as you found the truth on the COVID issue and the vaccine. Secondly, you are now talking about unifying people across party lines. It doesn't take a PhD to figure out that most of the people sitting on the Hill today are part of the same cabal. They are a uniparty, and they're all about, sadly, far too much money. We've got to turn that around. There are lots of Democrats and Republicans who agree with each other on the big issues. They've got to set aside whatever minor differences they have and unite to correct these major problems. We've got to do that, or we will lose our republic. And I think that's the message that you've been sending, and that's why your popularity is rising and will continue to rise.